This AMD EPYC Genoa has been the best processor on the market for the last 6 months, but things are changing. Because now you can get this AMD EPYC 96-core Genoa-X with 1.1 gigabytes of level 3 cache. That is so much cache that someone told us that it actually meets the minimum RAM requirements for Windows 7. So maybe this is the best processor now, except for one thing. Because this processor is a 128-core 256 thread AMD Bergamo. But what's more, all three of these processors have legitimate claims that they are the best and fastest processors on the market, and that's what we're gonna get into today. Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we are gonna take a look at the new processors in the AMD EPYC family, because finally we can bring you on YouTube the AMD EPYC Genoa-X and AMD EPYC Bergamo performance figures. All three of these processors are fast in their own right, but for different reasons. And I know a lot of folks may be watching this and are saying, I'm not gonna go buy a Genoa today, maybe I'm gonna buy it tomorrow, maybe I'm just a home lab person, like why do I care about this? Well, let me just kind of give you a thought. We have over here some of the previous generation processors. And if you were to go back to the Milan, Milan X, or even just the Rome generations, you're gonna find that the chips are a lot less expensive because this generation is just so much bigger. And just to kind of give you some frame of reference, this is the AMD EPYC Rome, and this has a green little thing on the outside. And one way to think about it is that this goes up to 64 cores, and the cores on here are about equivalent to what you would find on the cores on AMD EPYC Bergamo, except well, you can get twice as many. And that's just super cool. Now the game plan today is that we're gonna do a little bit on Genoa-X, but it's pretty similar to actually the Milan X, just in the Genoa cores or Genoa version. And then we're gonna talk about Bergamo because I think that's the new one that would be very exciting for folks. And if you watched that intro and thought, I already know which one is the fastest, it's the highest core count one, well, I would say you're not wrong, but you're also not necessarily right either. Just watch when we get to the numbers and we'll show you. And before we get too far in this, I just want to say thank you to AMD for sending the chips and also Supermicro for sending a couple servers that we could use to actually go test these things and just kind of show you how they work in the different servers. Like everything we do, this is being done completely editorially independently. Nobody gets to review it before it goes live, but I just want to say thank you in advance. And I just want to say thank you real quick to all the STH YouTube members who are really helping us do these types of reviews because, you know, we got to go buy RAM and all that kind of stuff, and it costs a lot of money. And if you can help out, you can always join down below. With that, let's talk about the new chips. Okay, before we get too far, I just want to point out AMD's strategy here. AMD has 3 different processors meant for like 3 different types of applications that all go into the socket SP5 socket, and they're all basically the same generation of core. So you can take this same socket, this SP5 socket, and you can have a standard high performance one, you can have a high cache one, or you can have a higher core count chip and put it in the exact same socket. And that doesn't even include anything that comes in the future for this same platform. So this is a very flexible socket, and it also means that the motherboard vendors and system vendors are able to design like one system and house all kinds of different applications. That is, however, very different from what we've seen previously, where typically a SKU stack was just built with like, okay, you know, there's some more cores and maybe some more frequency in this one and maybe a little less in that one. And that used to be how a server SKU stack is made, but that's not the case anymore. And since we already have a video on the AMD EPYC Genoa where we go into a ton of depth, if you want to learn about the basic, you know, SP5 socket, all of the architecture of Genoa, go check out that video. We'll link in the description. But if you do want to see a little bit more about Genoa-X and especially Bergamo, that's what we're going to go over next. Okay, so we already showed you what Genoa looks like here, but then the question is, what does Genoa-X look like? And frankly, from a chiplet standpoint, it looks very similar, but there is a difference. Genoa-X takes the 3D V-cache stacked L3 cache dies and puts those on top of the CCDs. And frankly, when we took a picture of Genoa-X, you basically can't even tell that they're there. Now, this processor is the AMD EPYC 9684X, and that X tells us that we have that 3D V-cache and it's a Genoa-X part. And this is the high-end model. This is the full 96 core model, which means that between the cache that's on the normal Zen 4 dies or CCDs, as well as the stacked V-cache, we have a total of 1,152 megabytes of level 3 cache here, or what we could just call 1.1 gigabytes. Now, if you were to go look at things like the turbo frequencies, you would still see that this is a 3.7 gigahertz max turbo part, but AMD did a couple of things with this. First, it increased the power, or the default power of these. So it has gone up from like 360 watts up to 400 watts on the X part. And even with that, we saw just a slight clock speed disadvantage to this versus what we saw on the just standard Genoa part. So there is a little bit of an impact, but the idea is that you're not going out to memory as much because you have this giant cache, and because you are not going out to main memory, well, that means that you're getting a ton more performance because these cores are fed. Now, a few years ago, we actually did a video talking about the gigabyte era of CPUs, and this is one we also have the Xeon Max that we're going to be doing a video on soon, but you can check out that old video where we talk about how the caches and the memory on chips are getting to be much larger. Now, this as a 96 core part is quite interesting because frankly, that thing has just a ton of cache and a ton of cores, and there are a lot of folks that are going to like that. But AMD is doing something very smart with Genoa-X that I think a lot of folks just kind of gloss over. There are actually 3 different SKU levels. So there's this 96 core part, but there's also a 32 core part, and that is the 9384X, and then there's a 16 core part, which I think is the like 9184X. That 32 core and the 16 core part do not have the full set of 12 CCDs on there. Instead, they're only the 8 CCD designs. And what that means is that instead of getting 1.1 gigabytes of cache, you get, I think, 768 megabytes of level 3 cache, or about 3/4 of a gigabyte. And so those two parts are definitely not grabbing the headlines, and we don't have those parts. AMD didn't send them, but I actually think that those parts are super interesting. Let's say that you have a VMware server and you decide that, hey, this high cache mode is something you want to take advantage of. Well, then the 9384X, that thing has 32 cores, but it has 768 megabytes of level 3 cache. That means that each core will have 24 megabytes of level 3 cache to it. So if you want to fit in that 32 core per socket licensing, that's a pretty cool option. Then there's another one though that might be even more interesting, and especially will be interesting to the Microsoft Windows Server folks out there, that there is a 16 core 9184X, and because it still has that 768 megabytes of level 3 cache, that means that your total cache per core is 48 megabytes of level 3 cache per core. That is insane. And at the launch event, I actually told the AMD guys, I said, well, Genoa-X to me feels like it's Milan-X, but just Genoa. And they said, yeah, that is exactly the idea. So I guess that's the right way to think about it. The big one by far in this generation though is Bergamo. Bergamo is the first chip that we've really seen in the server space that's not using the same Zen 4 core and Zen 4 CCDs as we saw on like Genoa-X, and actually frankly pretty similar to what you see on the Ryzen parts. In Genoa, each one of these CCDs has up to 8 cores, but those are pretty big cores. So what AMD did was they did something pretty ingenious. They said instead of creating like an entirely new architecture, what if instead they cut the level 3 cache in half? That means that while a Zen 4 part will have 4 megabytes of level 3 cache per core, the Zen 4C only has 2 megabytes. And that's gonna sound a little bit weird because we just did Genoa-X saying like, hey, what if we did a ton of level 3 cache? But this is kind of going the other way. The reason for that though is really obvious, and that's the fact that cache takes up die space, and by removing cache, you get more die space to go put cores. And what AMD found during the process was that not only can you get savings from the like die area of that level 3 cache, but there are also some things that you could do, just kind of like routing different traces and all that kind of stuff, because everything's more compact, that you get some savings out of the core that way as well. And so instead of having 12 8-core CCDs like we would see on, a Genoa part to get up to 96 cores, this is able to hit 128 cores using only 8 16-core Zen 4C CCDs. That is a whole lot of gobbledygook in terms of acronyms. So if you were not cache limited at all, this could actually be the fastest part because you just simply have more execution resources. But unlike Genoa-X, where you have a like 16-core to 96-core range, the range on Bergamo is much tighter, right? You have a 128-core and then also 256 thread part, so SMT, is on. And then you have a 128 core, 128 thread part, which is your SMT off part. And then you also have a 112 core and 224 thread part. And I guess the idea with that one is it's like, okay, well, we got 96 cores, we got 128, let's put something right in the middle there. And I think folks are gonna ask, why aren't there like lower core count Bergamo parts than 112 cores? And in my just personal perspective is, I think AMD said, look, if you're going up to 96 cores, you should be using Zen 4, but if you do want to just kind of get that extra bit of density, then use Zen 4C. And if you're sitting there and thinking, hey Patrick, 128 cores, we've seen that before from STH, both on video as well as a number of reviews on the STH main site, you're totally right. The Ampere Ultra Max M12830 has already been in this space, and it's actually a fairly similar clock speed. Ampere clocks this one at, this is the 30, so it's 3 gigahertz. The AMD EPYC 9754, well, this one is, I think it was running at around 3.1 gigahertz for most of our testing. And all the cores were just kind of pegged at that, so it wasn't like what we were seeing a lot of like jumping in terms of frequency. And I know a lot of folks are gonna automatically jump and say, well, this is an ARM chip, so it must be faster and it must be, more efficient and all that kind of stuff. And I'm gonna just tell you to hold on for a second, because even in the best case scenario for the Ampere Ultra, it turns out that this is, I've been telling people that I would consider this on the integer side to be about a third of what AMD has here in terms of performance, although at the same core count. And that is by design, by the way, by the Ampere folks. There's a very specific reason for that we'll talk about in our performance and key lessons learned sections. But now that we've gone over how Genoa-X is different than Genoa and also how Bergamo is different, well, why don't we go and actually talk about some of the performance side of this? Okay, so let's talk about the performance of these chips, because that is the most exciting part of this by far. The 9654 is a very fast part, and added with the new Genoa-X and Bergamo, we have some very fast CPUs, but they're fast at different types of tasks. So let's start with some industry important benchmarks like Spec CPU 2017. When we look at the FP rate, you're gonna see that AMD just has a lot of cores, and that's why they tend to do well versus Intel, but you're not necessarily gonna see a huge jump for the Genoa-X performance, and the reason for that is just, frankly, this is not something that's using all of that extra cache. It's designed, frankly, for less cache. So that's a good example where we have an HPC focused part, but it's not even doing that well in an FP benchmark, or not doing like crazy well in an FP benchmark, just because it's really designed for that cache optimization, and that's not what the benchmark is trying to stress. When we move over to the spec int rate side, well, things change quite a bit here. Perhaps the biggest thing though that I can tell you about this is not necessarily an Intel to AMD comparison. I think the more interesting one to me was the difference between Bergamo and Genoa, because 128 cores versus 96 cores, and if you're thinking the instruction set's the same, it should be like, Zen 4C should be like way faster because you have more cores and all that kind of stuff. That's actually not the case. And I think the reason that's not the case is because the Bergamo system seemed to be limited to about 3.1 gigahertz, and it almost seems like AMD limited the chip frequency to 3.1 gigahertz specifically to drive all of the cores at like that boost clock as much as possible. We ran literally like stress NG on this thing, and we could not get the frequencies to budge off of 3.1 gigahertz, just to kind of give you some idea. So where a lot of the ARM vendors say like, hey, if you go x86, you have a challenge because you see all this frequency scaling, that wasn't the case here. We could see a lot better performance though on things like our virtualization benchmark. We definitely saw the impacts of both the additional cache as well as the extra cores, and the cache thing is the same thing that we saw on Milan-X. On things like our pricing analytics, we saw something very similar. And actually, just hosting the STH website, that was an interesting result as well. But given what we saw on other benchmarks, it was about what we would expect. I will also just note that there are some benchmarks that scale very, very well with the number of cores you have. So things like C-Ray and things like that, where you can actually go and just kind of split things up and scale very well. I think those tend to do well. On the other hand, there are things like the Linux compile benchmark where there are just parts of that process that are limited to like one or a single thread performance thing. And there, if you have 128 cores and only one of those cores is actually go running at like full speed, well, that's not really an efficient use of a CPU, right? Now, I know a lot of folks are going to be focusing on the Bergamo performance here because that's really the biggest new thing. And when we look at the AMD EPYC 9754 next to the Ampere Ultra Max both 128 core parts, you're gonna notice that why I tell people generally that you're gonna see at least 3x the performance on the Bergamo part. And that makes sense because AMD is designing its cores for like the maximum performance per core. On the other hand, Ampere is doing something completely different. Ampere is saying, hey, we're gonna have 128 cores, but our goal is to provide a certain amount of performance per core. So think about like cloud providers, they say like, hey, we want this spec-in rate, we want these other metrics to be like this level of performance. And then Ampere says, okay, we'll give you that plus maybe a little bit, and we're gonna go and scale that out. And so each core will have its own execution resources, and it'll be very uniform across the chip. AMD's version is kind of a little bit different. They say, hey, look, we're gonna give you the same type of cores, just with a little less cache that you had on our mainstream processors, and we're gonna give you as much performance as we possibly can in this chip. We also, have to remember that Bergamo is using a lot more power than the Ampere Ultra Max. So on the efficiency side, it's a lot more similar. One other thing that's super important is that Ampere advertises that its current generation Ampere Ultra Max has 128 cores, and each one of these cores has its own execution resources, and that means that you get 128 VMs. Now, Ampere also has the Ampere Ultra 1, which is a newer generation core, new features, and up to 192 cores that we should hopefully get in the next couple months or so. AMD, on the other hand, they can only do up to 128 VMs, but each of the VMs can have 2 vCPUs, so you still end up with the same number of VMs, it's just you tend to see a lot more performance on the Bergamo part. And that is on the integer side. On the floating point side, the AMD EPYC is just so much faster. But again, that's exactly what Ampere is trying to do, because they're just trying to hit what is my vCPU requirement, for performance, and then, how do I get a little bit more than that? That's what their goal is, whereas AMD is going just much, much faster in terms of performance per core. But the next really interesting part is definitely power consumption. So let's get to that next. Okay, so I think the first thing we should talk about is power consumption. Now, we have a pretty good sense that, if you have an AMD EPYC 9654 96 core part, you're gonna see power consumption on a, just kind of mainstream dual socket server, and somewhere in that maybe 850 to 1000 watt range. Of course, that depends a lot on options and all of that type of stuff. And then when you get down to a single socket system, you're gonna see a maximum of about 500 watts. Now on the Genoa-X side, you're gonna see that the power consumption actually is gonna go up from there. We saw in a dual socket server that we were getting about 100, call it maybe 90 to 110 watts, but we'll call it about 100 watts difference in terms of our dual socket power consumption using the X part. So that extra 3dV cache does come, it's definitely great to have, but it also does come at a power cost. And so on the Bergamo side, something really interesting happened. We saw that the power consumption was pretty darn similar to what we saw on the Genoa side. Like, I don't really think that you would do anything differently from a sizing standpoint with your 96 core Genoa versus your 128 core Bergamo. But what I think is probably a little bit more interesting is what happened when we put it into a single socket server. We had it in a single socket server that was from Supermicro, and we were seeing power consumption very typically in that maybe 450 to 550 watt range. And that was just depending on what we had loaded in the system. So the cool thing about Genoa-X is just that thing is just 1.1 gigabytes of level 3 cache. Like what the heck else do you want? Of course, it's going to use more power, and you're going to pay the power for it. But on the Bergamo side, I think the cool thing is the fact that AMD was able to do so much in a relatively limited power budget. I mean, this thing is actually a performance per power consumption leader over an ARM chip, which is insane, and a lot of people don't even think that's possible, but clearly it is. Of course, we have to wait to see what Ampere 1 does. Now, with all these, I love to have key lessons learned, so let's go do that next. Okay, so with all of these videos, I love to have a key lesson learned, like what should you take away from this video? And I think there are a couple things especially because we did this just giant review, right? The first thing is that Genoa-X is awesome, and there are certain workloads where Genoa-X does very, very well. And we're gonna have a little bit more of a comparison to Genoa-X and Xeon Max in a little bit, but I'll just tell you the short summary of that whole review is gonna be that depending on your workload size and how well it works in cache versus how well it works in 64 gigs of memory, that's basically everything you need to know about how those two chips are gonna perform. The fact of the matter is though that 96 cores is a lot of cores, and it's more than Intel has. So Genoa-X is a very strong part, and I do think, to me at least, that the lower core count 16 and 32 core ones are probably some of the most interesting chips that are gonna launch this year. But you're gonna notice I didn't even change back into the blue shirt for that Genoa-X because I really wanna talk about Bergamo here. Now, Bergamo gives 128 cores, 256 threads. I am only worried about one thing with Bergamo. My number one worry is that AMD has too much performance per core. The reason for that is that Ampere is specifically targeting what cloud providers have told them, like, hey, we want this much performance per vCPU. Now, it's not the best comparison because the Ampere Ultra Max is a 2-year-old part and the Ampere one is coming out, but at the same time, I think that AMD really showed that, number one, it can do a lot in performance with that x86, and it's not doing bad performance. Like, we're not seeing that this is a really terrible like power efficiency on it either. It's actually doing better than what ARM was doing 2 years ago on their chips. So that's something to keep in mind, that AMD doesn't just have a 128 core, 256 thread part where you could have, say 128 2 vCPU VMs serviced by it. The other side to it is that it's actually relatively efficient. And I know folks are going to immediately say, well, Intel has X, and Intel really doesn't have anything that's competing in this cloud native, cloud optimized space yet. That'll be Sierra Forest. Hopefully we're going to see that in 2024, and that is probably the chip from Intel that I am most excited about, because if you've seen our E-core line where we're doing all these kind of little firewalls and stuff at the edge, those E-cores, the next step for those is going to be to come into server chips, and I think that frankly bringing a Skylake or faster Cascade Lake generation performance on an E-core and putting a whole bunch of them onto a chip is a super exciting thing, and I just can't wait to see Sierra Forest. But at the same time, for what we have now, we have Bergamo, we have Ampere Ultra Max, and we're going to see a lot more cloud native processors in the future. Now, nobody has a crystal ball, but one thing I can tell you for sure, this cloud optimized segment, if we were to go look 5 years from now and say how big, or project how big it's going to be, I personally think it's going to be somewhere between 25 and maybe 50% of all processors sold are going to be cloud native, or all cores sold are going to be in this cloud native segment. And then, I think that there are folks that even will say, 75% of all cores being sold are going to be more of these cloud native cores, because sometimes you just don't need all of the features and all the performance that the giant cores that we've managed to make for things like high performance computing. You just don't need that. Instead, you just need a VM to go run, Nginx or something like that. And so that market is absolutely exploding. We've seen Ampere in that market. We now see AMD entering that market with something that's very strong. Ampere will be following up pretty soon with Ampere 1, which will be a lot faster. And then hopefully next year, we're going to have Intel with its cloud native processor segment. So maybe the key thing that we learned out of all of this is that no longer is a CPU for a server, or the fastest, best CPU for a server, going to be a clear-cut answer. Because if you just have a general purpose workload, because you get a little bit higher clock speeds, the just standard Genoa part is actually the fastest. And if you have other workloads where you need a lot of cache and you're hitting memory all the time and you can cache those kind of accesses, well, then Genoa-X is going to be faster, even though it's at a little bit lower of clock speed. And then for other workloads entirely, you're going to see that these cloud native processors that don't have anywhere near as much cache, they can actually perform super well because, well, they just have a lot of cores. And so you might be thinking, well, AMD has the most complete portfolio at this point. I mean, clearly we've shown that, right? And while I think they do have a very strong portfolio at the high end, what they're kind of missing is what comes below SP5. I think that's why AMD has platforms like Sienna that will be coming up, and I think that will address that market. But right now, they don't really have that kind of, you need a 8-core lower end processor that's higher end than a Ryzen with more features, but lower end than what you get in an SP5 socket. The AMD really doesn't have an answer yet. So hopefully we'll see that pretty soon. Hey guys, I know this was a long one, but I hope you like this look at AMD's new awesome server processors. Whether you're in the market for a server processor today, or you're gonna just be doing research onto what's gonna be making into your home lab in the next, say, 3 years or so, I hope that you found something useful in this video. If you did like this video, why don't you share it with your friends so they can see all the cool stuff we're doing. Also, give this video a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.